so much for joining us this evening. I am delighted to welcome you to our Munich Dialogues on Democracy evening with Professor Jan-Werner Mueller. I'm Bartley Grosser-Richter. I am the founder of Munich Dialogues on Democracy, which is a cooperation between the Yale Club of Germany and Munich's Amerikahaus, which is the Bavarian Center for Transatlantic Relations. The topic this evening is Trump's lesson, Rebuilding Democracy After the Crisis. The title implies that our speaker thinks there's a crisis right now. Wherever you sit on the political spectrum, I think we can all agree that we certainly are living through a very intense moment in history. The COVID-19 pandemic still has the world in its grip. We seem to have entered a second phase here in Europe. This has moved all of our events online for now, so our original plans for an Oktoberfest-themed reception after a lecture at the newly renovated Amerikahaus tonight had to be shelved. But as tired as we all are of Zooming, I am thankful that we can continue to have events with brilliant speakers, even though it's virtual. So I'd like to start by thanking our members, our donors, and our supporters for sticking with us and making these events possible. We are incredibly grateful for your continued support, and we will continue to try to pursue our goals for our community in these uncertain times. We will get back to the high energy in-person events sooner rather than later, I hope. But being virtual does have a very concrete advantage in that we can welcome people from all around the world. So welcome tonight or today, depending on where you're joining from. Those of you who are part of the Dialogues on Democracy community, the Amerikahaus community, or just joining tonight to be engaged in a part of the conversation, welcome. I'd also like to send special greetings to those of you on the West Coast of the United States suffering through these horrific fires and smoky air. We are thinking of you and we are with you, and I hope it gets better soon. And finally, a very warm welcome to the community from Amsterdam's John Adams Institute, who we are happy to reciprocate with for online events. I met our speaker at a birthday party almost exactly 3 years ago. His book, What is Populism?, had come out in 2016 and had been translated into 20 languages and was a bestseller. 3 years ago, there was already enough going on in the world to fill an entire evening of incredibly animated conversation. But boy, oh boy, 2020 has not disappointed, so I'm really looking forward to tonight. Our speaker, Jan-Werner Mueller, is the Roger William Straus Professor of Social Sciences and Politics at Princeton University. He studied at the Free University Berlin, University College London, St. Antony's College Oxford, and Princeton University. From 1996 until 2003, he was a fellow at All Souls College, Oxford. From 2003 to 2005, he was a fellow in modern European thought at the European Studies Center at St. Antony's College. And since 2005, he's been teaching in the politics department of Princeton University. The list of institutions around the world where he has held posts is long and includes the most prestigious universities in almost every European country, East and West. He regularly writes opinion pieces. You may have read him in the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, the Süddeutsche Zeitung, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, etc. And he's the author of several award-winning books, printed in dozens of languages. He specifically asked me to keep the introduction short tonight, but I'd like to just mention two more things. His book last year came out, Furcht und Freiheit für einen anderen Liberalismus, and it was published here in Germany by Suhrkamp and won the Bavarian Book Prize. And this year he's in Berlin as a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin and working on a new book that will be entitled Democracy Rules. It will be published in May 21 by FSG in English and in Germany by Suhrkamp under the title Freiheit, Gleichheit, Ungewissheit, Wie schafft man Demokratie? So before we get going, I want to let you know that you can ask questions during the conversation on the YouTube live chat page, or if you'd like to go large screen and not watch the chat, email to event@amerikahaus.de. That's Amerikahaus in German, AMERIKAHAUS.de. My fantastic partners over there are directing the technical aspect tonight, and Joanna King and I will be fielding questions after the introduction talk by Professor Mueller as well. So we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can in the time that we have. I hope you all have your time zone appropriate beverage of choice. Jan, I'm thrilled that you joined us. Thank you very much. I'm turning it over to you to start the conversation.
Thank you very much, Bartley, for this very kind and relatively short introduction. Since you mentioned encounters in the past, I've had a chance to hear a little bit about the creation of the Munich Dialogues on Democracy and I followed the creation and flourishing of the initiative over the years from afar, and I'm very honored now to be part of it and to appear here at least on the screen tonight. Bartley also, in an actually very helpful way, left the question open as to whether we are really living through a crisis of democracy or not, or whether it is merely, as she put it, a kind of high-intensity moment in history. I agree that there's a lot out there of what the writer Saul Bellow once referred to as crisis chatter. So a kind of inflationary, to some degree, maybe irresponsible use of a word which, at least if you go back to the original Greek meaning, really is meant to refer to a life and death moment. Not just any old problem, any old difficulty, but really a fateful situation where the very existence of someone or something is decided. And if we take that seriously, then you might say, well, look, not every time that somebody tweets something nasty is a crisis, or not every time that a country decides to vote in favor of leaving a supranational economic organization like the European Union, even though it might be a terrible policy idea, is necessary a life and death moment for democracy as such. So allow me to suggest a couple of more precise criteria as to how to think about this whole issue of crisis of democracy. Then quickly, in the second chapter of my brief introductory remarks, pivot to the situation in the United States. And then as a last chapter, quickly and alas, more relevant than I would have thought before Friday of last week, talk a little bit about the question how the opposition to right-wing populist rulers should act in order to save and ideally even promote democracy. So what's a real crisis? Well, I can think of at least two scenarios that would merit crisis in the real sense of that term. One is a real breakdown of political order, a situation where the various players in the poker game simply no longer accept the outcome of certain procedures, and very likely the result of that is going to be violence. A sort of classic example of this, you might say, is something like Chile in the early 1970s, before the military took over. But there's a second scenario of crisis that you might say is less obvious, and it's arguably the one that has become more prevalent in our era. It's a situation where a real turnover of power is no longer really possible, even though, in theory, democratic institutions remain in place, the facade of democracy and the rule of law remains standing. But the idea that people who are not already in power have a chance, a good chance of actually entering power is more or less eliminated. That doesn't mean that democracy is only about, elites sort of taking turns in being in power. We can talk more about what this ideal of alternating in power really normatively implies. But in a commonsensical way, I think it's fairly clear that a situation in which basically parties no longer really lose power is one in which we can no longer meaningfully speak of the existence of a democracy. Now, both of these criteria, alas, increasingly might apply in the United States as it is today. We increasingly see harbingers, at least, of this more comprehensive breakdown of political orders, where essentially the players in the game no longer necessarily accept the outcome of a process. I hardly need to remind you of what President Trump is already saying about an election outcome that might not be to his liking, and his reaction to that sort of scenario. But also, and less obviously, we have a situation, somewhat paradoxically, you might say, of, on the one hand, hyperpolarization, as everybody always correctly observes, and at the same time, and that's the paradox, you might say, hollowed out and relatively weak parties. This diagnosis, I think, applies to some degree to both parties. And yet, as also many observers have rightly said, we're not really dealing with anything like a symmetrical process of polarization, but a highly asymmetric one. It's really only one party that has become much more extreme in the last decades. It's really only one party that also systematically tends to deny the legitimacy of the other side, a process that started way before Donald Trump. I'll just remind you of the kind of Republican talk we already heard in the 1990s, when they talked about Bill Clinton as your president and no longer as our president, breaking with a tradition of recognizing the legitimacy of the office holder. And beyond that, and this is really, I think, the crux of the situation we're in at the moment, we have one party, the Republican Party, obviously, which in many ways is committing to something that can only be described as minority rule, or what somebody like James Madison actually would have called the tyranny of the minority. Everybody remembers this famous expression of the tyranny of the majority. You go back to Federalist 10, to Madison's writings, and you see very clearly that he was as worried about a tyranny of the minority as he was worried about a tyranny of a majority. Why do I put it so starkly? Well, I put it so starkly because, as a number of our colleagues in political science, I think, have demonstrated very clearly, the Republican Party, as we know it today, is committed on the one hand to policies, especially economic policies, which happen to be deeply, deeply unpopular. The highly conservative preferences of not even the 1%, forget the 1%, more like the 0.01%, are not ones that vast majorities in America tend to share. And yet these are the policies which the Republican Party keeps pushing officially, and as we saw with the 2017 tax cut, which, when they have the chance, they will actually implement. Together with these highly unpopular economic policies, as everybody knows, we find what can only be called by now a sort of all-out commitment to right-wing populism in the form of an all-out culture war, where questions of politics and policy are always reduced to questions of belonging, the idea that there are some who are the real Americans, of course, usually white Christians, and everybody else doesn't really belong, isn't really entirely legitimate. It's this particular combination that, for instance, Paul Pearson and Jacob Hacker recently have named, and I think with a very good expression, plutocratic populism. The two are not sort of necessarily logically or coherently connected, but to put a complicated story in very, very simple terms, you might say that the culture war stuff and the populism stuff largely serves to detract attention from the, after all, highly unpopular economic policies. Now, if you have a party that on one level is aware that it defends minority positions, if you have a party that also knows that in the face of long-term demographic change, as it is happening in the United States today, it basically is going to be on the losing end increasingly in elections, then it also becomes more comprehensible why this party is doing everything possible to entrench its policy positions, either in unelected institutions like courts, or in a more circuitous way, by essentially shrinking the people, the demos, to its own liking, to essentially engage in various forms of voter suppression, various forms of disenfranchisement, in order to basically preserve its kind of constituency in a position of power as long as possible. Now, when we talk about the causes of this fateful development, there's obviously quite a lot to say, and I hope we can maybe come back to a more historical account later on. But for now, allow me to highlight some more general features of parties in general that might explain why the Republican Party in particular is, in a sense, no longer properly functioning in a way that a political party that, by definition is trying to reach as many voters as possible, is trying to construct coalitions and majorities, why this isn't really happening anymore, and why a crucial part of democratic politics, or what you might call the infrastructure of democracy, has broken down. I think one important element is that parties, after all, are meant to generate something like a coherent long-term commitment to basic political principles. And for a long time, it could still look like that the Republican Party was actually doing this. I mean, you always heard, of course, about limited government, free trade, etc., etc. But as we've discovered in recent years, de facto, the whole platform became increasingly coherent. And if you think back to the summer, has now been essentially abandoned altogether. There's a really extraordinary moment where in the run-up to the National Convention, the party basically said, we're not issuing a new platform at all. We are simply sticking with the 2016 platform, and we are pledging our complete loyalty to our leader. That's not what political parties are meant to do. I don't want to idealize their role. They're not philosophy seminars, as we all know, but they are meant to produce policies in response to ongoing and evolving challenges as the world inevitably changes. And the Republicans have basically entirely given up on that and have basically said, we are just pledging our loyalty to this more or less authoritarian leader, and that's all you need to know about us. And it's also all the culture war stuff that we will tell you about us, but that's basically it. An extraordinary declaration, you might say, of intellectual bankruptcy. Related to that, you might say, is an extraordinary absence of what for shorthand you might call internal party pluralism. Again, I don't want to idealize this. I don't want to pretend that political parties should always consist of, fantastic long meetings where people, give long speeches about abstract principles. Some of you may remember Oscar Wilde's famous observation when he said, the only thing that was wrong with socialism was that it took too many evenings. And those of you maybe in the audience who have been to some socialist party meetings can perhaps confirm that he was onto something when he was ridiculing the tendency to spend endless evenings, debating abstract ideas. That's not what parties are generally also meant to be about. And yet they are committed to principles, and no principle magically applies itself. One does need to talk about how they actually apply in particular historical situations. People differ on these questions while remaining committed to the same principles, so they don't become enemies or adversaries just because they sometimes disagree inside a party. And this kind of pluralism essentially, I think, habituates citizens, especially politically engaged citizens, to the very basic democratic notion that maybe, occasionally, sometimes, the other side could possibly be correct, and that there isn't always one singularly correct answer that could be decreed by the leader of the party. That's actually the reason why some countries, including Germany, for instance, have made internal pluralism in parties a matter of law. It's actually in the constitution that you cannot have an authoritarian run party. And the, I think, plausible thought behind it is that if a party is authoritarian on the inside, there's a fairly good chance that sooner or later it's going to be authoritarian on the outside as well. And as we've again discovered over the last couple of years, there's virtually no pluralism left inside the Republican Party. There's no meaningful debate. There's no sense of respectful disagreement about certain issues. There is a kind of, if I may put it very succinctly, a kind of slavish adaptation to a more or less imagined Trumpist base. And yes, behind closed doors, of course, senators and others will say to journalists that they profoundly disagree with certain things, that they can't believe that, the latest tweet said this, that, and the other. But this is not something that evolves or happens in a healthy, democratic, pluralist kind of way. I partly highlight these more abstract points because I think they apply beyond the immediate situation in the United States. I think also in Europe and also in other parts of the world, we see a kind of general decline of parties. We see a general decline in internal pluralism. We see a general inability to perform the kinds of roles that parties should ideally perform in a democracy. So let me swiftly move on to the third and last chapter, namely pose the question of how other actors in a democracy, in the case of the US, of course, primarily the Democrats, how they should react to a situation like this, how they should react to the rise of right-wing populism, or in this case specifically, the rise of plutocratic populism. One thing that I think has yet to be fully understood and learned is that not everything that right-wing populist leaders say or that these parties do is necessarily authoritarian. A certain degree of run-of-the-mill policy disagreement continues. So let me give you an example. Probably any Republican president would have tried to gut or maybe entirely abolish the Affordable Care Act. Personally, I think that's a horrendously incoherent, very cruel idea, but for me at least, it's hard to argue that this is equivalent to the end of democracy as such. If, by contrast, a president defies the regular function of Congress having oversight, that's not a run-of-the-mill policy disagreement. That goes to what, for instance, the political philosopher John Rawls called constitutional essentials. This really is about the very basics of democracy. And I'm highlighting the difference because a good opposition party will also highlight it, and it will say to voters, look, we understand that you come from a different perspective as far as all kinds of policy issues are concerned. Of course, our job as the opposition is to criticize the government. That's entirely normal democratic politics. But at least occasionally, we want to persuade you that something more is at stake. One problem, and I only flag this briefly, and maybe some of you want to come back to this later. One problem with this idea that there might be lots of voters out there who could be persuaded if one says that constitutional essentials are at stake. One problem with that scenario is that a number of social scientists have recently shown pretty convincingly that actually a fair number of our fellow citizens are quite aware that right-wing populist authoritarian leaders are chipping away at democracy. It's not true that they're all uninformed or they're entirely inside the information silo and don't really understand what's happening out there. The really bad news is that at least some of them appear to be willing to engage in trade-off and to basically say, yes, for the sake of partisan loyalty or my personal economic interest or whatever it might be, I am willing to trade off at least a bit of democracy. So that makes this idea of persuading people on the basis of shared constitutional essentials a little bit more complicated. But that still leaves one audience to which opposition parties could address themselves in place. And that's basically the very parties they are opposing, or in the situation we're in right now, the Republican Party in the United States. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they should try to shame them because the shameless cannot be shamed. But I think at least on occasion, there could be a kind of tit for tat retaliation for egregious norm breaking. This is a difficult argument to make. Many of our colleagues who've been writing about the death of democracies recently have advanced good reasons to say, look, this is dangerous. This could lead to a kind of downward spiral of norm breaking, where basically we're going to have increasing chaos, where in a sense we end up certainly with crisis scenario number one, where a political order as a whole might break down. But hear me out. I think in a situation where you have a very clear asymmetry, where Republicans have basically now for quite some time been saying, look, we're going to grab whatever power we can. And we don't care about niceties and norms anymore, something that, of course, we are seeing live right now as we speak when it comes to filling a vacancy on the Supreme Court. When that is sort of the one side, and the other side plays by the old rules, then obviously it gives one side an enormous advantage. If the other side launches a credible threat to respond in turn, it might change the game. And more important still, I think we have to remember that not all norms are the same. And not everything that is sometimes called a norm is even properly normative. People have, for instance, said, look, Trump doesn't have a pet in the White House. This breaks a presidential norm. How come that he doesn't have a dog or a cat or whatever you think an appropriate Trumpian animal might possibly be? But obviously, that's a completely trivial norm. If you look at some of the proposals that Democrats have already made and that Republicans have called norm breaking, you realize that actually what they're doing is perfectly in line with underlying democratic principles. I'm thinking about efforts to protect the vote, to make voting easier, to reverse the major attacks on basically the basic right to vote in the United States. I'm thinking about statehood for Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. These are not things that can't be justified with proper democratic principles. And yet, as some of you may remember, when these proposals were made, Mitch McConnell, the great gravedigger of American democracy, immediately came out and said, oh, this is just a democratic power grab. But again, these things are not symmetrical. So what I'd like us to think about harder is a more creative response to basically constitutional hardball, as it's sometimes called, on the one side, and the selective breaking of norms in order to restore the game to its proper health. As I said, that's a risky proposition. I don't mean to deny that, but given how far process breaking has already advanced in the United States and in a number of other countries, I think it will be a mistake at this point to shy away from that particular question. I thank you for your attention so far and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Jan. Let me make sure. So it's funny. I want to pull out one thing you said right away because I wrote it down. I wanted to talk to you about it. You wrote an article on September 2nd about this difference in the constitutions in Germany and Spain and Portugal versus the United States. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that, because I think a lot of people don't understand what that really means. So when you say that there's an internal party pluralism and people have to have democratic debate within the party versus what's going on in the States, could you maybe expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So at least some European constitutions really make it mandatory in terms of how you have to regulate the internal life of a democratic party. Arguably, Germany has gone too far in this process. I mean, if you look at the German party law, for instance, there are incredible details about how often you have to have meetings and who has to have a say in what. I'm not saying every country now has to adopt a similar model. The idea is not for our German speakers, am Deutschen Wesen soll die Welt genesen. Absolutely not. But the normative thought behind it, that you ought to cultivate proper democratic deliberation, proper democratic decision-making inside a party, I think is an important one. And if you look at what has happened in other countries, for instance, the party of far-right populist Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, which, well, nominally has two members, him as a person, and then a foundation of which he is in turn the only member. It's kind of hard to see how you have internal dialogue and get used to democratic decision-making if it's one person having a dialogue in their head. Or think of another very prominent far-right populist in Europe today, Nigel Farage. The Brexit Party boasts on its website that it has 100,000 supporters, which sounds great, but then you realize, well, it's actually a limited liability company, where if you look at the company records, there is only one person of significance who really makes decisions. That happens to be Nigel Farage. So again, I don't want to idealize these processes. I'm also not saying that they never happen in the US. Of course, caucuses still happen. There are still meaningful sites of debate, but it's something that I think has declined massively Think of the fact the Republican Party simply canceled a number of primaries this year, even though there were significant contenders on the stage. For shorthand, never Trumpers who said, look, it's very important that people have a choice, that somebody else gets to make the case for a different understanding of conservatism in the context of the US. I think that was largely sidelined, that was largely shut down. I think that's bad news for a democracy as a whole. Now, what shape should it exactly take in the US is something we can debate. I think one of the things that for Europeans is sometimes really difficult to get one's head around is that on the one hand, American parties, of course, are extremely loose. They don't have members in the sense that European parties have, card-carrying members who pay dues and who regularly need to go to meetings and so on. But at the same time, of course, they are highly regulated by states, which have laws about what kind of primaries can happen, whether they're open, they're closed, and so on and so forth. So it's something that would take, I think, a significant degree of ingenuity in terms of agreeing on what party life should really look like, how you could also move away, but that's a somewhat different question, from a frankly sort of insane system where early states in the primary cycle have enormous influence and can lead to outcomes where we have nominees in the end who, had it been, let's say, a poll on one day where whoever gets the popular vote in a party wins, could have been completely different. So that, I think, is the deeper, I think, point, that not everything is Trump's fault. Trump is a symptom of something and not the cause of something. And a lot of these difficulties, a lot of these problems are structural and predate Trump. And I think it's important to at least occasionally, take our eyes off the latest tweets and to try to creatively think about how to address some of these more basic structural challenges.
Super, thank you. I have a follow-up question that takes it out of the party and into the public. I had the privilege of spending some virtual time this week with the students at the PPE department at University of Amsterdam, the Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, about being engaged today. And they had some great questions. And one of the students from Brazil brought up that Brazil has compulsory voting. And I didn't know Brazil had that. I do know Australia has it. I'm not sure where else has it. What do you think about that? And do you think that could work in the United States?
So I'm glad to now have 3 hours to answer this very simple question in an appropriate fashion. For shorthand, I'm in favor of this. I'm in favor of this idea. It's not a panacea. I mean, nothing is a panacea. I mean, there's a kind of democracy innovation industry out there where sometimes people want to sell you this idea that, oh, if only we had citizens assemblies, or if only we did this, then all these issues would be solved. Obviously, that's not plausible. If you think about Brazil, it's sort of one of the, I think, not often noticed ironies among observers on the outside, that, at least if I understand it correctly, that actually a lot of progress was made in terms of campaign finance in Brazil in recent years, partly against the background of enormous corruption scandals. But then people didn't realize that WhatsApp was an enormous possibility for basically powerful, well-resourced actors to influence an election in a context where very few people have full access to the internet because it's very expensive, but they do have WhatsApp. And then basically a lot of Bolsonaro's backers saw this as a possibility to basically spread fake news, to push him in a big way, even though a lot of the other stuff in Brazil, at least on paper, looks very good, including compulsory voting. One more substantive reason in favor of that, and maybe we want to come back to that, but I don't want to slip into lecture mode if I haven't already, I think, is that in an increasing number of countries, we see a trend of basically the worst off to check out of politics altogether. This is what sometimes in the European context has been called the two-thirds society. So 2/3 of our citizens remain engaged, they vote, they think that something is in it for them, they think they have a stake in the political system. And a lot of people at the bottom of the income ladder simply are checking out. It's not true, by the way, that no, it's great, as soon as they get an anti-immigration party, they all come back. It's not true. I mean, many people continue to opt for a we don't want to vote at all. Now, obviously, there's a kind of liberal question about, is it really okay to force people to vote? Why isn't it legitimate for people to say, look, I don't like any of these parties. All these things are horrible. Even the clown party isn't quite what I want to opt for. Sure, but you can still, I think, include an option that says none of the above, or people to spoil their ballot. That's always a possibility. That's always a possibility as well. But at least some studies, and I'm not pretending this is conclusive, but at least some studies, I think, tend to suggest that compulsory voting is also associated with somewhat more egalitarian, in the socioeconomic sense, outcomes. So also from that substantive, for that substantive reason, I think there's a lot to be said for it.
Yeah, thank you. We were talking about how often it gives voice to more moderate positions too, because it's not just the extremes who are feeling motivated and voting, right? Joanna at Amerikahaus, did you want to jump in with questions? I don't know if Joanna can hear me.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
There's a bit of a connection issue. Yes, I have a question that came in via email from an audience member out of Kansas in the United States. And our audience member says, I live in Kansas, which is represented by 2 Republican senators, both of whom appear to have fallen in line with the blind support of President Trump and the party's position that you are describing. I believe that the Republican senators are the only ones who can check President Trump's authoritarian approach. Any practical suggestions how citizens such as myself can challenge this threat to democracy?
So the best I can say, and I realize that this is by no means original, is that one gets on the phone, one connects locally, one actually lets these people know that one might agree with them on a lot of substantive policy issues, but that one simply cannot condone the authoritarian tendencies, the kind of what the questioner called this kind of blind following of rule breaking, law breaking, etc. And I think this is not a completely naive or hopeless undertaking, because you remember that in the early days, quite a number of Republicans all of a sudden became very uncomfortable with going to town hall meetings. You recall that when it came to the vote on the Affordable Care Act in the Senate, actually contrary to the sort of myth that has been built up around Mitch McConnell, who's presented as this genius who is so devilish, so Mephisto-like that he always wins. They lost in the end because there was enough bottom-up pressure, including on some Republicans who felt that actually no, their constituents didn't really want this. So I realize this is a little bit in the Mr. Smith Goes to Washington territory of, if only decent people kind of pick up the phone or go out marching, the world will change. But I think it remains actually the most plausible answer, especially if you make it plausible to somebody that, look, I'm not just yelling at you. We are on the same page maybe in terms of some of our shared principles, but precisely because of that, I'm going to have to draw the line. I might not vote for you. I might actually vote for the other side. This goes back to this point I was trying to make about pluralism, that if you basically have a party that says, look, you always must obey. If you disobey once, you're declared disloyal, then these processes don't function. Whereas if you are seen as somebody who's committed to some of the underlying principles, that also gives you leeway in terms of disagreeing without being called a traitor. And that's a very important element, both within a political party and in a democracy as a whole, that disagreement and conflict is possible without people being pushed over the edge.
Yeah, that gets to what there've been so many books. It's been raining books over the past few years, but basically we've all been taking democracy for granted for quite a long time. I have a question from Cleo in Munich. most of us in the West have taken democracy for granted until now. And she wonders if there are lessons learned or warnings from the US that could apply to European democracies or safeguard democracy, help us safeguard democracy in Europe, because on this side of the pond, we've got the AfD in Germany, we've got Marine Le Pen in France. You mentioned, Britain is in a horrible dilemma right now.
So I think I would say two things. One is that it's sometimes said in Europe that, when we have supposedly independent institutions, or when we valorize the rule of law, decisions made by judges or also by impartial commissions, that, this is just a facade, everything is political through and through, and we should sort of politicize some of these institutions even more. And clearly, this isn't working in the context of the US. I'm saying, what everybody is saying is by no means original, but clearly a lot of the structural problems go back to gerrymandering, go back to the inability to basically establish a sort of halfway neutral framework within which legitimate conflict can then unfold, because everything is politicized through and through. And that, I think, is a lesson not to go down this road of saying, oh, the more political it is, the more better, or the more legitimate, or the more we have elections also to all kinds of commissions, that this is necessarily a good thing. It's lesson number one. Lesson number one, I think, is maybe less acute, because I don't really see people in Europe wanting to go down this road. But I think it might be a worthwhile observation to make nonetheless. Of course, the absolute conventional wisdom nowadays about polarization is that, oh, it's because of social media and echo chambers and filter bubbles, and this exacerbated all these problems. And, as some of our distinguished colleagues nowadays put it, Facebook equals fascism and so on. If that's true, then yeah, we're screwed, because we're not going to undo this technology somehow magically. But what at least a couple of our colleagues, I think, have demonstrated very well is that actually it's not the technology in itself that has somehow created polarization and existential conflict out of nothing. It's actually, in the context of the US, regulatory decisions that predate the internet, that have to do with the end of what used to be known as the fairness doctrine, where both sides sort of had to be given a voice in making their points about the political question. It's the deregulation of cable and of radio, which still reaches most Americans to this day, which basically paved the way for the creation of what is now sometimes often called a kind of self-enclosed right-wing media ecosphere. And you all know the kind of television stations and the kind of internet sites which tend to dominate that. That has nothing to do with technology as such. This is not our fate. It's not that social media necessarily has to lead to these outcomes. These are questions of regulation. And regulation is still in the hands of democratically elected governments. Again, I don't see anybody in Europe right now rushing out saying, oh, it would be a great idea to follow the American model, and let's have more Breitbart in Europe. That would be fantastic. I don't see anybody saying this. But in case it arises at a question, I think this is a really worthwhile lesson to take on board. And I think it should temper the kind of apocalyptic pessimism that one sometimes nowadays hears about effects of social media, which I think have been vastly exaggerated. Also, last thing I'll say, also goes back to the Brazil example. It's not God-given that the internet has to be that expensive so that people have to rely on WhatsApp and can then more easily be manipulated. This is a question of economics. This is a question of regulation. So this is in answer to the often asked question in Germany, wo bleibt das Positive? So that at last was something more positive.
Thank you. Joanna, is anything else coming in on yours?
Yes, we have another question that we received via email. If the current status is indeed a state of crisis for democracy, and one of the reasons is the absenteeism of plurality in policymaking, why are there no meaningful efforts to establish new parties to break the duopoly and create natural choices for the voters in parliamentary decision making?
Yeah, very good, i.e. very difficult question. So I think the good news is that at least in Europe, there are such efforts, and some of them have even been successful. So I don't share the view that one sometimes hears that the decline of so-called established parties, or more specifically, the decay of so-called people's parties in Germany and other countries, automatically spells a crisis of democracy, or as it's sometimes put, a crisis of representation. In fact, maybe sometimes the opposite is true. If you think of countries like Spain and Greece, which used to be dominated by two more or less corrupt parties, and where then new parties arose, like Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, you don't have to like these parties. You don't have to sort of find their economic programs attractive. But it was, in a sense, a sign that the political system could actually change, and that more specifically, one of the major conflicts in Southern Europe in the last decade, and still today for that matter, namely austerity versus anti-austerity, to put it very simply, could actually be reflected in the political system. And it's been demonstrated that especially young people who had basically checked out of the democratic system and basically said nothing ever changes here, this is rotten to the core, actually came back to the polls, voted for a party like Podemos, and then most miraculously of all, when their party lost, they went back home and they continued to do activism or whatever they felt it would take to be more successful the next time. For us, this might sound completely normal, but if you think back to the 1970s, for instance, you could imagine that sometimes young people who've checked out of a system and who think that, look, this is absolutely rotten, this is absolutely not working, occasionally have more drastic ideas about what to do next. So I think it is important that party systems renew themselves, and this can include, lest I be thought of as, oh, only Podemos is great and all right-wing parties are bad. This can include parties on the right as well, as long as they observe, again, constitutional essentials that apply to everybody. The problem is that this is, of course, incredibly difficult in the context of the United States. And this brings us back to the, I know for many people, very boring and arcane subject of party regulation. But it is, alas, a fact that the two main parties in the US have been very good at keeping out challenges. It's not just that, oh, nobody wants to do it, or it takes so much effort to build up a third party. It's very hard to get on the ballot. There have been cases where people actually raised significant amounts of money, then they had to spend all that money on litigation in order to basically succeed in getting on the ballot, and there was little left for the campaign. So I'm not telling you anything new if I say that, well, the second best option then is to try some kind of insurgency, as it's sometimes put, inside a party. And again, you don't have to like Bernie, you have to like his policy proposals. But I think from a certain point of view, you might say that what he has accomplished within the Democratic Party is a sign of a functioning democracy, because he managed to mobilize people. If we believe now what the people around Biden are telling us, then yes, it really will have an effect, not just on the policy platform, which is easy enough, but on what they will actually do if they succeed. So in that sense, it's, again, one could imagine more far-reaching structural changes. As you know, the fact that we have a first past the post system in the US is not a matter of the Constitution. Congress could decide tomorrow that proportional representation is much better. But it's unlikely to happen in a situation where the two main parties, after all, also have a shared interest in keeping the system as it is.
On that note, how do you feel about the movement within the Republican Party? There are a couple of, there's the Lincoln Project and there's the Republican voters for Biden. Do you think that that's an effective way to be acting?
So I think what they have done is often certainly very ingenious, very creative, and it's to be seen whether it will have an effect or not. If these stories are correct, that The president got so upset about this that his own campaign had to put tons of money into running ads in DC just to make him happy and see something nice occasionally on television. Then yeah, you may say that's already a kind of accomplishment to basically troll him successfully. On a more skeptical note, I'm a little concerned that Democrats are welcoming some of these figures with arms that are maybe a little bit too open, and that they perhaps are too ready to say, oh, everything is forgotten and forgiven about some of the very significant policy differences, which of course remain. And more important still, I think some of these figures, with all due respect, have yet to reckon with their own complicity in the rise of what earlier on, following the Pearson Hacker book, I call plutocratic populism. I mean, clearly there's been a massive incentive to say that, oh, everything was more or less great, and then this crazy career criminal comes along and hijacks the party. It's almost like, here's the ship and this pirate comes and he takes over, and now we literally have to jump ship and sort of do something different in a little rowboat that kind of tries to sabotage the main ship. This has a history, and as I was trying to hint, at least since the 1990s, in certain ways, the Republican Party, figures like Newt Gingrich, have been preparing a situation where Trump became possible, where it became possible, if you recall, in 2016, for voters to say after voting, in response to surveys, do you think he's qualified to be president? No. Did you just vote for him? Yes. To create a situation where the other side is so demonized, is seen as so fundamentally illegitimate, that the choice basically of maybe on one occasion going with the other side is no longer there, because the likes of Gingrich have been telling everybody. You may recall this famous sort of list of words that he issued in the 90s, how the Democrats had to be called, depraved and evil, and I don't recall the specifics, but you get the idea. And again, the other side hasn't done that sort of thing, and I think it would be appropriate for some never-Trumpers to look a little bit more closely at their own role in that more long-term process.
Yeah, that's one of the conversations that I had with these students last week, because they were from all over the world, and I was talking about how in order for democracy to be strong, sometimes you have to be pragmatic. That we love the idealism of the youth, but sometimes if you're looking at something about to go up in flames, you're looking to be pragmatic. And they correctly said, that's great, but you're in the United States of America. It's always been rather easy. If you come from a country where it's been so corrupt, what do you say to people who are in democracies that are operating like a Hungary or a Poland right now, where it sounds rather to say just be pragmatic and vote for the best, and then when they say there isn't, it's a tough one, right?
So I mean, there are in these countries, there are parties on offer which are not autocratic or are somehow disreputable or not a good idea to vote for, including centrist parties that have sometimes tried to offer a different kind of conservatism. So I mean, just to take Poland as an example, since you mentioned it, Kaczynski and his party have sometimes portrayed Civic Platform as these are crazy lefty liberals. I mean, for God's sake, this is a Christian Democratic Party, which is actually very conservative on questions of, let's say, abortion and other ones. So it's not like, oh, there's absolutely no room for maneuver. But let me say something that maybe is a little bit more interesting, because the fact is that yes, you can sometimes have real dilemmas in terms of how you position yourself vis-a-vis autocratic populists who are already in power. So let's take Hungary, the other country that you mentioned. There's an opposition, but it's very fragmented, and it ranges from more or less far left to certainly forms of the far right. In a situation like this, it becomes a tough decision to say, okay, I'm going to vote for whoever is best placed to defeat Viktor Orban and his corrupt Fidesz party. Because let's say you're on the liberal left, all of a sudden you ask to vote for somebody who in your eyes might look like a neo-Nazi. And then all of a sudden things go completely haywire and you end up with a far-right government. I mean, that would not be an outcome that, you know, one would have sort of nice dreams about. So one way of responding to that is to say, look, there's actually a different form of defeating governments like this, where this dilemma doesn't come up. And I'm talking about something which has been so derided after 2016, namely the idea of a popular referendum. People nowadays often say, oh, no referenda, that's what, you know, that's what populists do, and this is irrational people will make crazy decisions like leaving the European Union and so on. But one of the great advantages of a referendum is that it's a binary outcome, right? It's not like party politics where we're going to have 10 different parties in parliament. No, it's basically this or that. And that means that if an opposition tries to craft a good question, where it can embarrass a government, where it can actually show that a right-wing populist government that says we and only we represent the people actually doesn't represent clear majorities. If it can do that, then it might push something like this without having to agree on entire platforms, without having to say, oh, let's pretend that, you know, the left liberals and the far right are really the same, because they're not, obviously. So that's actually one reason why, interestingly, far right populist regimes are actually scared of popular participation. It's true that very often they have sort of fake national consultations where they send around basically questionnaires with, you know, highly manipulative questions and so on. But in a really open-ended process where people feel something is at stake and where the government might be wrong and where an opposition could really make a difference is something that they absolutely don't want. And that is something that you as an idealistic young person could try to push without having to basically face the sometimes potentially very tough dilemmas of more ordinary party politics.
Okay, super. I think we have one more question from the email. Joanna, did I see that right?
Yeah, we've got one last question from our live stream chat. Can you foresee the constructive or destructive influence of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party on the maintenance of democratic order going forward?
So when people nowadays, with sometimes, you know, a very obvious dose of disappointment, say, look, you know, Bernie mobilized so many people and we came so close, and yet again, speaking of idealistic young people, actually young people didn't come out the way they should have. And actually, going back to Barley's earlier question, it was probably very often never Trump Republicans who, you know, pushed Biden over the edge in certain states and so on. If people kind of throw up their hands in despair like this, I think they tend to forget that sometimes presidents who ended up pushing and even implementing very progressive policies were not necessarily very progressive characters. With all due respect, Lyndon B. Johnson was not a paragon of progressivism and left liberalism in mid-20th century United States. But he came face to face with a highly mobilized part of the population. And, you know, to be fair, he also had a sense of decency that he eventually used his enormous political skills honed in the Senate to kind of push through what he felt had to be pushed through at the time. And something similar, I think, could even be said about FDR, who was not necessarily predestined to be the great hero of progressivism, but who saw the pressures of a strong movement out there. So the message, if there is any, is to say, you know, don't despair just because the nominee isn't the person that you would have liked. A lot depends on whether people remain mobilized. And last example I throw in, because it's closer to our time, remember the many people who, you know, of course, greatly admire Obama, but who also will sometimes politely say, why did he demobilize so drastically after 2008? Why didn't he keep using this kind of groundswell of people really investing in the idea of change to put pressure on whoever he needed to put pressure on? Of course, instead, we had the Tea Party. And I dare, and it's not exactly very daring, I dare predict that if a Biden administration is in place, we're going to get sort of Tea Party on steroids. We're going to get Trumpist movement on steroids. So there will be pressure. The question is who exerts greater pressure in favor of which ideals.
Thank you very much, Jan. I don't know if that's a super optimistic way to leave, but I guess it means that we all have to stay engaged. On that note, I would put in a PSA because we are talking about being engaged and it's an election year. So if you are an American living abroad, you can request your ballot very easily at votefromabroad.org. And the ballots for Americans abroad have already been sent out. So I would suggest that you do that. It's on our website if you have not yet done that. I would like to thank Dominic Raab and Joanna King also at Amerikahaus. I don't know, do you guys want to wave? They're always behind the scenes and they do such a great job. I don't know. Okay, thank you very much. Amerikahaus has officially moved back into their historic location on Karolinenplatz, and they're open to the public right now. They've got some fantastic art exhibits that are socially distanced, and so I would encourage you to check out their program and what they are doing. And I would say we are working on an event for December with Yale professor Anna Westad, who is a professor of global affairs, turning our look towards China's relationship with the West. I'll have more information on that up on our website soon, Amerikahaus website as well. We're hoping it can be hybrid, in person and virtual, but we're going to see what Monsieur COVID has in store for us in the next few weeks. Lastly, what's really exciting is that Jan has agreed to come back in the spring, hopefully in person, when his new book comes out. So mark your calendars and watch that. Let's hope it can be in person in the fabulous theater at Amerikahaus in Munich together then. Jan, thank you so much for coming tonight. It was wonderful. And wherever you are, stay safe. Thank you very much